Welcome back to Moments That Matter. We're continuing our series, Books That Matter, and our guest today is my friend, Mary Campbell Huss Norman, who I call MC. MC is a Clemson graduate in English, living and working in Tennessee, and she is a reader. Welcome, MC.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Though MC could choose literally hundreds of books she's read, today she is going to be talking about a personal favorite of mine, Anxious People by Fredrik Backman. You might recall that I guested on here talking about the novella My Grandmother Asked Me to Tell You She's Sorry by Backman. He is a Swedish author, and he writes hilariously and poignantly about seemingly disparate people that have nothing in common, who, it turns out, have everything in common. So I do want to warn the listeners, it's going to be really hard to talk about this book and not reveal spoilers about the story, but we're going to do our best not to ruin it for everybody. And, but you never know what might slip out. So, of course, the author himself actually gives away a lot of the story in the very first paragraph, and I'm going to read that right now. He writes, a bank robbery, a hostage drama, a stairwell full of police officers on their way to storm an apartment. It was easy to get to this point, much easier than you might think. All it took was one single really bad idea. So, MC, how did you come across this book? What was it that caught your attention?
First of all, just got a library card because I just moved. And so I was very excited to see all that my library card could do. And I didn't know, but I could actually rent audiobooks, and I have a really long drive to work. And so I want to find an audiobook. And I really liked the cover of this one. And so I started listening to it, but I just got so hooked. He's just so funny.
He is.
And my husband, I actually started making him listen to it pretty soon after I started it, because I was like, I have to talk about this with someone. And we just have talked about so much. Like, it's so fun, the kind of jokes that he makes. They feel so like personal and in the moment, because it's like if you try to repeat it to someone, it's like, okay, I know that doesn't sound that funny, but if you were reading the book, like, it's really funny.
Yeah, there's a lot of situational humor
Yeah.
in the book for sure. So what did you find interesting or compelling or meaningful about the book?
I feel like the more that I've been kind of like reflecting about it, there are two things that really stuck with me. The first one, and I will try very hard not to reveal anything, but obviously, if you're listening to this, you know that there's a bank robber, and it kind of starts out telling the story of the bank robber, and it has this kind of like he has this phrase that he keeps saying of like, after he explains the situation, he's like, but you would never do this, you're a decent person. Or like, you're a decent person, you would never find yourself in this situation, you wouldn't let it get to this point. And at the beginning it's like, oh, well, yeah, like, I'm a decent person, I'm not going to rob a bank, or I'm not going to be involved in a hostage situation, like, I'm just a normal person. And then the more and more you get to know this character, he keeps saying that phrase, and it just makes you catch yourself kind of like in the beginning when you were like, yeah, and then in the middle when you're like, maybe I wouldn't do that, and then at the end you're like, this is me, like I am this person. And I feel like I did these things, like I feel like it's so close to home, like I know this person and I understand why they made all of the decisions that they made. I don't know, it really was just like he gave me one fact, three facts about the situation, and I'd already like determined so many things about this character. And it was just like, oh man, I think that so much about people just in general. This terrible thing happened and I'm reading about it somewhere. Man, that sucks, but I'm a decent person. I wouldn't find myself in this situation. Oh, wow. Yes, I would. Like, I
Yeah.
totally would. If these were the steps, and they very well could be, absolutely. That was a big thing. And then another thing that I feel like Sawyer, my husband, and I have just talked about is one of the characters quotes their late spouse and quotes them quoting someone. I don't remember who they're quoting, but my husband's telling me it's Martin Luther.
Okay.
But he says that they would always say, like, if the world's going to hell tomorrow, I'm still going to plant an apple tree today.
Yes.
And that phrase has honestly just, I don't know, that's just rocked my world. It's starting to change a lot of the way that I see things, the way that I just like daily tasks that I'm doing just makes things feel a lot more important for different reasons than I thought initially. But I have a lot of thoughts on this book, but those are probably my two, if I could sum up how it's translated in my life for me, I would say that's.
Yeah, so that quote is, even if I knew that tomorrow the world would go to pieces, I would still plant my apple tree. And going back to the first point that you made about the bank robber, there is one huge assumption that the reader makes through about at least half the book that turns out to be, completely in error. And so there are things that are just kind of revealed as you go along, and you realize I have a very particular way of looking at the world, and that's I think one of the great benefits to me of Bachman's writing, is that he just unearths these things, and makes you just think about how you think about things, which is kind of cool. Was there a particular character that you kind of warmed up to or identified with? Would it be the bank robber or somebody else?
I honestly, at first, I didn't like any of them.
Yeah.
And then I ended with being, oh yeah, this is my friend group. This is like, these are my best friends. Like,
yeah.
And I love all of them. I really loved, gosh, now I'm forgetting the names. I loved Jim. He is one of the police officers.
Right.
There's another kind of twist, I guess, that happens with him. And I just thought it was beautiful. I feel like in the same way I assumed a lot about him, that he like just so gracefully like proved me wrong. And there were a lot of things that were revealed that I could tell were like, aha, you thought this, take a look at yourself, and his character was one of those things that was revealed that was quieter than that, but really powerful. And just the relationships that he had with all the other characters, and the way that he could, I don't know, I think I assumed, because he's like this policeman, he's a little older, he's like obviously a little out of touch with just things that are going on. And I kind of feel like I just assumed he wouldn't see me, and he doesn't see any of these characters really. He doesn't have the time or space for it. And you find out in the end, he has been holding all of them, like just in such a subtle and huge way all at the same time. And I don't know. I think that he did such a beautiful job creating that character and helping me learn a lot about myself and the way that I want to look at people in a less overt way. But I also loved, is her name Esther? Did I look that up? She was precious. I love her. She was my favorite from the moment that we met her, just because she's awesome. And I also really enjoyed getting to know the therapist.
Yes.
She was a very interesting character for me. I really like how she tied in. all the other stories, in that she doesn't really have that much interaction with the characters like in the present tense, but is like so deeply intertwined with their stories. Like equally, they are part of the most impactful thing in her life as she is part of the most impactful thing in their lives. And I don't know, I just thought that he did a really good job of making her seem so human.
Hmm.
Really,
I,
all of those characters are so human.
I think that's what he does the best is he starts off with characters that are almost caricatures,
Yeah.
and you're like, oh, I got this person figured out. And then he humanizes them to the point where you're feeling actually badly about how I
Yes,
thought it
totally.
earlier. Uh,
Yeah.
it's like, oh, okay, actually, I want to be friends with this person.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He also, to me, writes beyond his years because Jim's relationship with his son, both being police officers, and so there's that father-son dynamic, which is really strained. We could
Yeah.
probably put it that way. But this Backman's kids are relatively young. I mean, they're not grown,
Yeah.
but he talks about this like he's lived it. I mean, it is
Yeah.
really something. He said something in the book that I actually quote in one of my books because I'm talking about like my relationship to my father, and this is like he just nailed this thing. He says that's an impossible thing for sons to grasp and a source of shame for fathers to have to admit that we don't want our children to pursue their own dreams or walk in our footsteps. We want to walk in their footsteps while they pursue our dreams. And it's just like, oh my gosh, where did this guy get this thing from?
Yeah.
Yeah, so much wisdom in these
That's
books.
crazy. I guess like I didn't know that he had young kids. I
Mhm.
was imagining him as like at least 150 years old. Like
Something
he
like that.
yeah, I'm like, you have lived all of these lives. Like
Yeah.
so many of them, and you're so aware of them. You couldn't have written all of these characters without being these characters. That is really crazy that he's not a very old person.
Yeah, I think he's still in his 40s. Um,
Wow.
yeah, he's had a lot of success
Mm,
very, very early, technically, I guess you would say early. Anyway,
yeah.
um, so I'll ask a question from English major point of view, okay? Because he's got this setup that he uses. The dialogue in the book goes back and forth between characters in the apartment who are being held hostage, and then the interrogations afterward, by the police officers, which are hilarious. But anyway,
Mhm.
and it reminded me, you may have not seen this movie, but for those that have seen this movie, it reminded me of Inside Man because they do exactly that same thing. It's a Spike Lee film. And so you see the bank robbery, and then you go to the interrogation, then you come back to the bank robbery like that. So did you think that that was effective, going back and forth as a way of, the storytelling, like past to present or present to future?
I think like you know, I have I enjoy reading a lot, and I'm also a pretty slow reader, and I'm a rereader.
Hmm.
And so I get like I can be very easily confused
Hmm.
in books sometimes. So at first I was kind of frustrated. Where am I right now? Like the first couple of switches back and forth where like I'm not really catching on. But as I started kind of realizing what he was doing with that, kind of what you were saying with like creating or just like presenting caricatures and then developing them, I feel like it just added a whole other layer of how perspective can change. Because I feel like at the beginning we were kind of in us observing the hostage situation and hearing what they know in that moment, and then going back into the interrogation and hearing what they know in that moment, I feel like they actually lined up a lot better as far as like what everyone knows in the moment. We're all kind of building that knowledge together instead of being presented with the whole of the hostage situation and then the whole of the interrogation. It's easier to compare like even ourselves to like the police officers and the assumptions that they make with the information they've been given.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, okay, I thought that too. And apparently they thought that too. So I'm not crazy.
Mm-hmm.
But then also, yeah, I don't know. I guess it's just easier to feel more connected with the characters
Mm-hmm.
because it kind of feels like the author is holding all of the cards instead of
Mm-hmm.
like there's a character in there that's keeping all these secrets.
Yeah.
It's like all of the characters are also a little bit confused.
Mm-hmm.
And so I feel like it kind of helps to build that friendship. Whereas if we were presented with the whole scenario at first, I feel like I would automatically be like, oh, I can't believe those police officers assumed this and this,
Yeah.
and like they're
Right.
terrible. And
Yeah.
I wouldn't be friends with them.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So I definitely think I thought it was really helpful for processing everything all at once.
Yeah. It was more, it was sort of that show don't tell
Mm.
kind of thing, and you realize, of course, that the characters are confused about what happened, even after the fact. They're kind of
Yeah.
confused about what happened, which makes the reader actually feel a little bit better. But also, just everybody has secrets, you know, and it's these secrets that are just kind of gradually brought out. Another interesting thing about the book to me is all the social commentary. There's comments on divorce, comments on addiction and drugs. And then, of course, probably the major thing is a lot of it centers around the Great Recession of
Mm.
2008 and how many people got wiped out, in investments and especially in the housing market. And he introduces this cold term. I'm just going to go off on this tangent. He introduces this sort of cold term, which is moral hazard. And this bank employee is trying to explain moral hazard to this guy who's basically lost everything and all he wants is a loan from the bank. And so she tries to explain like a textbook definition of moral hazard, and it's not working at all. And then finally she says, and by the way, the listener should know the author's favorite word, bar none, is idiot. He just uses it over and over in the funniest way possible. But anyway, so finally she resorts to explaining moral hazard this way. It's when two idiots are sitting on a creaking tree branch and the one closest to the trunk is holding the saw. You're the idiot farthest away from the trunk. The bank's going to saw off the branch that you're on. The bank hasn't lost any of its own money here, just yours, because you're the idiot who let them hold the saw. So yeah, it's and it's you also feel the person's pain through just because of the confusion. Like, how did I even get here? That I lost all this money and, I don't even understand what happened with the housing market and everything else. And all of us were in that situation, and so he just kind of, for me, he just kind of brings people in, and of course, this turns out to be a very important exchange, as it turns out, because the customer then goes out, stands on a bridge, and contemplates jumping. But before he does all of this, he writes a letter to the bank employee who he met, and she winds up carrying this let her around for the next 10 years. And so there are these kind of very random, meetings that turn out to be, these life-changing events for these people, which is kind of cool. And it's difficult to go a whole lot farther with that without giving way too much. So we were talking about, right before we started, we were talking about, you and I, this whole adulting thing that you're involved in now. MC just got married in January, and so she's figuring out all of this home life and work life and everything else like that. So I need your reaction to something from the book. Okay, a quote from the book. This is the author. When you're a child, you long to be an adult and decide everything for yourself. But when you're an adult, you realize that's the worst part of it.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like I had to like full stop at that. And I was like, yeah, like, I don't like that part. I was like, I don't want to do that anymore. And I've only been doing it for like 6 months. Like, that's hard. I mean, just like trying to find a doctor and having to go to my own doctor's appointments with a new doctor. And like, I guess this is a thing. I didn't want my mom to make me doctor's appointments, but I guess I didn't want to do it either. That's not fun. It's been a weird mixture in a lot of ways, because I guess this is a little bit of a tangent, but I'll tie it back in. I recently, my husband and I were at his aunt and uncle's, and I was telling them how one of the hardest things for me growing up was in Sunday school when we would talk about Adam and Eve, and I'd just be like, well, if God had put me there, I wouldn't have eaten the apple and we wouldn't be in this mess. But he didn't, and that was his fault. I would have been fine at this. And I think it's funny because a lot of things I tend to feel like that about in adulthood. Kind of just the whole idea of like, I'm a decent person, like I'll get by fine. Oh my goodness, like these it is not, like, it's very easy to fall into all of these things that I've thought were so, I don't know. I think about, just while we're talking about housing, in the past year in Chattanooga, the homeless population has grown by like a significant amount because all of the property value is going up. And that's one of those things where I was like, when I'm an adult, I'll understand that. Like that will make sense to me. Kind of weird now. I don't really get it, but I'm just a kid. One day I'll understand. And now I'm like paying my own rent. And I'm like, no, people are just homeless, not because they're choosing to be, like, people aren't robbing banks because they just feel like they want to rob a bank. There are so many small decisions and factors that are going into what it means to just be a person in the world. And I think that, I don't know, that's been a really big thing for me in this kind of season, I guess. And just in reading this book, you're a kid and you're like, this will make sense. I'm just waiting for this to make sense. And then you're an adult and everyone's like, now you make it make sense.
Yeah.
And you're like, whoa. What?
Yeah.
Like that's what this is? Like it was just all leading up to me having to put the pieces together. I don't know why I don't think everyone should be homeless. I shouldn't have an answer for that. Like that's crazy. And so I feel like it's, I don't know, I think he did a really good job of being like, we've all lived through it. We're all living through it. Everyone's acting like it makes sense. And it just doesn't. Like it just shouldn't be like this. We just shouldn't treat people like this. We shouldn't make assumptions like this. And it doesn't just like fall into place when you're an adult. Now you just find out, oh, everyone's just been cruising with this idea and we just shouldn't. I don't know.
Mhm.
I mean, that's a lot of jumbled thoughts about it, but
That's great. It all relates to the book for sure.
yeah.
Um, yeah, so my impression of Bachman is that there's nobody who writes about desperate people better.
Mm,
There's nobody who writes about desperation more so you can feel it
yeah.
than this guy. And the bank robber is a desperate person who feels like they don't have any other choice but to do this thing, and then runs into a whole other bunch of desperate people, who are just trying to figure life out.
Yeah.
And as it turns out, their lives are intertwined in interesting ways. Yeah, so that's what kind of keeps me coming back to him
Mm,
is I can feel what he writes, which
yeah.
is awesome. Going along with what I just said about desperation, he talks about drug addiction and drugs, and he says drugs are a sort of dusk that grants us the illusion that we're the ones who decide when the light goes out, but that power never belongs to us. The power takes us whenever it likes. And addicts are addicted to drugs, and their families are addicted to hope.
Mm,
And it's just like, oh my gosh, that is like so true.
yeah.
He just cuts through all of the stuff, and he just leaves you with truth. In fact, at one point he talks about truth, and I'll be interested to get your reaction to this. He says the truth, there isn't any. All we've managed to find out about the boundaries of the universe is that it hasn't gotten any. And all we know about God is that we don't know anything.
Yeah.
I mean, I suppose as Christians, we could say, well, yeah, there is truth. But nonetheless, the more you find out, the more you realize you don't know.
Yeah. Well, I think, yeah, that's so interesting. I feel like that's just been a running theme, especially in my studies. I started out college in majoring in special education, and then I had an English class. It was world literature, and I was so interested in it. I was just hooked, and I was like, I just want to do this forever. Like I just want to hear about these things. And so then I switched my major over to English, and then I would get into an American literature class. And I was like, oh, yeah, I just want to know everything here. Then you like start unpacking it and exploring all the books, and you're like, oh, wow, there's a lot here. And it's like, oh, okay, America's pretty young. Wow, let's go to British literature, And then you start unpacking British literature, and you're like, oh my goodness, there's just a gazillion years with so much literature here to explore. And then it's like, well, that's just like Western literature. Like, what about Eastern writing? Like, what about like literature from all over and all different cultures? And it's like the more and more, like the more categories that I find, I am in over my head. This is going to be a lifetime of exploring and learning. I don't know. I think that's something that this author does really well of explaining that through the way we analyze life and people. But I don't know. I think it somehow leaves you feeling very hopeful about the multitudes that exist. I feel like a lot of times there's so much when God is talked about there, it's just backed with all of this built up resentment of you are so much more and I don't know anything and I hate you for that. And I just really feel like it was not resentful at all
Mm-hmm.
and not hopeless at all,
Yeah.
but so real and so full of all of all of the emotions of like being confused and being frustrated and being curious and being hopeful. I don't know. I think that he did such a good job of, I don't know how he did it, but he just made me feel okay about
Mhm.
the fact that we don't know everything, and we can't know everything about God. And the more that we get to know about God, the more we realize we don't know about God. And in the same way, like the more we get to know the bank robber, the more we
Mhm.
realize we don't know about the bank robber, like as we dive into their childhood and
Yeah.
their family unit. And it's like, oh, there are so many things that I couldn't possibly know about this person. They are so complicated, and it's better that way, because
Mhm.
actually the least interesting quality of this person is that they robbed a bank.
Mhm.
That's the thing that
Mhm.
I'm least interested in now that I'm friends with this person. I don't care about that. Let's talk about everything else. And I almost feel that way with what he's saying about God and people, just that it's kind of cool that we don't know stuff, and it's scary, and it also can be really hopeful and good, and maybe we can assume good things.
Yeah. Maybe you know Brian Stevenson with
Mm,
Equal Justice Initiative,
yes.
and uh, he has this very poignant part of a TED Talk, and he's talking about how we judge people, and especially how we judge kids
Mm,
in the court system. And he said that he believes that if you uh, take something, you're not just a thief, you know. And we might say here, if you rob a bank, you're not just a bank robber, you
yeah.
know. And that's a message that really comes across with Backman, I think,
Mm,
is you really need to know how complicated life is and how full these characters are, and
yeah.
you really can't make judgments, based on one action that seems heinous to you, or something like that.
Mm,
And that's just a great reminder, you know, um, not to judge on surface appearances.
yeah.
Um,
Just funny
so,
that I chose the book based off the cover, now that I'm
well,
thinking
that
about it.
that may be the case, but
Ah.
that's why they design covers. So it's fun.
You got me again.
So, MC, if you wrote a fiction novel, what would it be about?
I'd hope something really cool like aliens or something, or like some cool fantasy
Hmm.
novel. But when I actually think about it, probably I would hope actually something similar to this, just normal people who are actually just like every other person, and finding such, I mean, even just uh I just think about the all of the imagery that he has just with this scene of this bridge,
Yeah.
and I hope, and I imagine it as just this beautiful and scary and dark and bright, lovely, nauseating scene. And I'm like, I want to write something that creates images like this, because that is how I see the world. That is
Hmm.
how the world exists for me. And I feel like for everyone, I guess I can't speak for everyone, but like I just think that there is so much beauty in the contrast of that, of all of the dichotomies that exist all at the same time in the most normal and mundane and silly and unfortunate things that happen.
Hmm.
Just the fact that like all of the friendships that just like blossom from this story, and it's like the most unfortunate thing, and it's the silliest and sweetest thing too. Like
Yeah.
I maybe like kind of like this book, but it's with aliens.
Okay.
So
Alien
that
bank
I guess would
robber
be
and
my dream book, Alien
yeah,
Bank Robber.
yeah, alien hostage situation.
Mhm.
Okay,
Yep.
cool deal. Well, MC, thank you so much for your time. Really
Yeah.
enjoyed talking to you about this book. And I do recommend for our listeners any Bachman book. Just pick one off the shelf. It's just fine. He's got lots of them. He's a very prolific guy. He's got another one coming out apparently this year in the fall. So, yeah, I highly recommend that. And thank you, everyone, for your time listening. And we hope that you'll join us again on Moments That Matter. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Moments That Matter, a podcast that looks at the moments in our lives that come along from time to time that have consequences long after the moment, especially those moments that have to do with the choice of vocation. In his book, Let Your Life Speak, Listening for the Voice of Vocation, Parker Palmer speaks of a clearness committee in the Quaker tradition, wherein a group of older, wiser people ask questions of someone considering a life choice as a way of clarifying the next step. We may not meet with a committee about these big decisions, but we all have these critical junctures in our lives, which we can think of as clearness committee moments. We need to pay attention to these moments because they are profound and potentially life-altering. We'll relay stories from our lives and interview others about theirs, especially noting the clearness committee moments, those we choose to recognize and those that were sadly ignored, those decisions that were made with God in mind and those that were not. Our hope is that these podcasts will cause you to think of the same kind of moments in your life with new clarity.